All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome here to the State Library. Thanks to everybody for giving up their early Friday evening to this event. But yeah, hopefully we'll have a bit of fun and talk about some things that are quite important. So this is the final of the public forums in this difficult conversation series that the Griffith Climate Action Beacon is putting on this week. So this topic is about urban climate justice, and we're wanting to think about what urban climate justice looks like. So first things first, and I'd like to acknowledge the land that we're on, and acknowledge in particular that this place, Kurilpa, has not been ceded, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians and pay my respects to the past and present elders and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So we've got a number of people here on this panel this afternoon, and I might sort of introduce them as we go along. Firstly, though, I guess I'm interested in teasing out some different dimensions of urban climate justice. Now, my name is Chris Butler, and I'm a lecturer in the law school at Griffith Uni. I'm also associated with the Law Futures Centre, and some of the things that I've done in my research in the past have involved questions of law and geography, and thinking about the way that space is inherently political, and the way that we use space, the way that space is occupied, is a really crucial and often unacknowledged aspect of life. And so cities themselves, urban spaces, are really important parts of any society. Australia is one of the most urbanised societies in the world, and I think we need to think increasingly about how climate change is going to affect processes of urbanisation and how we can live within cities in ways which are capable of looking after us all. So it's often presumed that climate change is a generalised process which is going to affect everyone, everywhere, in the same ways. But increasingly we're realising that in urban spaces, the differential capacities of people, the ways in which cities are already very unequal places, these are going to be reinforced and emphasised as the climate crisis takes hold. So this idea of urban climate justice provides a way of thinking about how the impacts of climate change are unequally distributed, inequitably shared, and that we need to address these ways in which the exacerbation of existing forms of injustice within urban environments can be ameliorated and addressed. I'm so happy that slide came up as the list of people here. I've forgotten the order in which these slides are rolling out. So we've got some people here sitting on the couch. I'll come over and join them in a sec and stop hiding behind the podium. So we've got Councillor Jonathan Shrie sitting on the far right. No, I shouldn't say that. No, sitting on that. He's on his own left there, so yes, that's probably a better way of thinking about it. Councillor Shrie is he's a writer, a musician, a community worker, and he was elected in March 2016 as the first ever Greens councillor for the Brisbane City Council. So he represents the Gabba ward, and he was re-elected in March 2020, and he's got a very strong interest in local issues such as housing affordability, economic justice, improving public transport, and he has a particular focus on transparency and democratic accountability in local governance. So some of these issues I think really neatly tie into the themes that I think are important in addressing climate justice at an urban level. Now, we've got a Associate Professor Kurt IVerson. Is Kurt Kurt's on the Zoom? There's no way we can't see him at the moment, can we? Oh, there he is. Hey, Kurt, I'm so glad you're there. So Kurt's at the University of Sydney. He's an urban geographer who works in the School of Geosciences. He's an active union and community organiser, and I've been following his academic research for a number of years now. He works a lot on the relationships between cities and political citizenship. So his latest book is a co-authored book called Everyday Equality. The subtitle of that book is Making Multicultures in Settler Colonial Cities. So he's not only an activist and an academic, he's also a regular commentator on urban issues in Sydney. So we might sort of cross over to Kurt in a little while, and he had some really interesting things to say earlier today at a session we did, particularly talking about the changing nature of work as we address the climate crisis. Sitting on the closest to me here is Greg Kitson. Greg's a PhD student at Griffith who's doing research about the notion of country and its relationship with urban planning. So Greg is really interested in trying to validate and value the experiences and knowledge of urban and peri-urban Aboriginal peoples, and focusing on connections to country as a really important component of meaningful forms of participation in the planning system. So he's committed to raising the profile of Indigenous community planning as a contemporary land use planning theory and also form of planning practice. We've also got Penny Elliott. Penny is a teacher and an activist. She's a founding and active member of both the South East Queensland Union of Renters. She's involved in the Revolutionary Communist Organisation. She's interested particularly in political economy, in history, and radical solutions to the ecological crisis. So Penny, I hope, can give us some insights into what I think are some of the most fundamental concerns that we're going to have as climate change increases the impacts on the urban environment, and that's the issue of how are people in precarious housing situations going to be taken care of. We've got Ruby and Al, who are here on behalf of Growing Forward. So this is a network of community guerrilla gardeners who are responding to the increasing rates of climate-induced disaster and health pandemics like COVID-19. So their focus is on growing sustainable food, on sharing skills, and distributing free produce to people who need it. So they've created gardens that encourage radical action. So maybe to have a break from me talking, let's welcome these other guests here with in the usual way. All right, so I'm going to click a button and see what happens next.
When we think of climate change, our minds often go straight to its significant effects on our natural environment. But we're increasingly understanding that this crisis extends to our urban environments too. The emerging concept of urban climate justice focuses on the need to recognise that the impacts of climate change are not evenly distributed or equitably shared. It's clear that climate change is going to intensify many existing urban problems. People are going to find it more and more difficult to access affordable and sustainable housing. We already have unequal access to urban transport, so there will be increasing issues of mobility justice that will have to be addressed. And the quality of urban and suburban infrastructure, our technological and communications networks, and the investment into our built environment are all divided along socio-economic lines. With so many competing issues to attend to, we must ask ourselves, how do we create appropriate governance and decision-making processes for addressing the impacts of climate change? And what are the potential conflicts that will arise in our urban spaces as a result of climate change? And above all, in recognising that cities are more than human spaces, how do we achieve just and equitable outcomes for people and communities, but also for other species and the ecological systems that our urban spaces are part of?
All right, well, here is where I get a chance to do my little mini lecture, and then I might sit down on the couch and be a bit more comfortable. There's a couple of things that I was thinking of prior to today and sort of reinforced, I guess, when we were talking about these issues earlier this morning. That I think urban climate justice requires us to think about a bit more deeply. One of these things is just the notion of justice, the way that word is thrown around a lot, and it doesn't always mean the same thing to everybody. For some people it simply means, providing procedures that make it easy for everybody to, have a vote or, perhaps have a say in some kind of planning consultation forum. For others it means addressing inequality and redistributing resources and making sure that there's people who are left out are allowed to participate more fully or able to, engage in things like retrofitting their homes or having access to cheap public transport. Now, I think that all of those components are important, but I'm sort of particularly interested in thinking about ways in which we are able to move from that simple notion of distribution to bigger issues of participation and transformation. How are we able to put in place systems of decision making? How are we able to involve people more in the not only the planning but also the producing, the reproducing of the spaces that we live in? But I think that climate change has really made us think a little bit more deeply about the way in which it's not just humans that we're thinking about anymore. Justice also needs to extend to other species. So cities themselves are not these spaces which are free from nature. They are inevitably part and interact with the natural environment. And I guess that leads on to the second point, this idea of the city being a kind of hermetically sealed environment which tries to keep nature at bay. We know that that's obviously ridiculous. We need to recognise more and more how urban spaces are permeated. They're not just social environments, they're permeated by ecological metabolic systems which interact with nature as well. And so climate change is not simply something that's happening to the natural environment. It's not just something that's creating desertification or destruction of the equilibrium of the oceans. It's also a social crisis. It's something that we need to recognise as both social and natural. And this leads, I think, to issues about politics. It's inevitable that if we're going to talk about justice, we have to grapple with some difficult questions about how the rectification of these issues will involve political conflicts. It's not going to be easy to bring everybody along at the same speed. There's going to have to be a reckoning with powerful interests that want to resist change at both the global and local level, and it's going to involve, I think, some important strategic decisions about how those issues are addressed at different scales. So, simply waiting around for the federal government to make the first move on changing policy settings is not going to be enough anymore. And so, one of the things we did talk about a bit this morning was the notion of trying to initiate and assist local actions as well as trying to do things at a global scale. So this idea that we've got that politics only happens at particular scales is being reframed all over the place, and climate change is certainly an area where we need to think about what are the appropriate forms of political agency that will work at those different scales, whether they're local, national or global. So I wanted to maybe turn some of these questions over to the panel we've got assembled here on the couches, or the arced couch. I was going to bring you in here first, Greg, if you're okay with putting on the spot first. I guess the first thing that I think is important is to recognise the issue of involvement of First Nations peoples in how we go about trying to address not just climate change as an abstract concept, but how it is manifested in an urban setting. And I was just wondering if you would, like to respond to what you think might be the most appropriate processes for enabling Indigenous people to be not just involved, but actually take a meaningful role and perhaps be given some power in making those sorts of decisions.
Yes, the first thing I can think of is it would have to be centred totally on country, and that would obviously include the traditional owner groups who belong to that country, but also the numbers of other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that actually live in urban areas, which is pretty much where most of us live these days. But you were talking about, processes and governance and those sorts of things. I think for Aboriginal people in particular, it has to be at the country level first before it can be in these other spaces, because each group will have an understanding, I think, of the issues at hand because of climate change, but also the types of ways that they'd like to address things, of the list of things that you actually had up there for themselves, so that their voices can be heard in the higher level planning. So I think for them it's really important that they're able to have that voice coming from country. But also for the numbers of other Indigenous people living in these spaces, because the majority of us are actually living off our own countries. And while we're living in urban areas on the country of our brothers and sisters, we do have some moral responsibilities and obligations that we should be practicing. And so if the model is done properly and it's based on country, then it will give those people an opportunity to contribute, because further down the line, where it's all connected out into regions like where I come from, in Waka Waka country, we're all connected, and there will be some flow-on effect at some point.
Okay, thanks for that. Jonathan, you can either respond perhaps to what Greg said here, or I was also just thinking about whether there are other things that come to your mind when you think about the urban context of climate justice.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say. I guess I should start by adding to that acknowledgement and recognising that land rights is climate justice, and picking up on what Greg said, that really the solutions are in Indigenous ways of knowing and centring Aboriginal sovereignty and anti-racist justice as kind of the core of that struggle. For me, like I just spent a whole day at a conference of all the mayors and about 100 city councillors from southeast Queensland, and we spent 3 hours talking about the Olympics and 1 hour talking about the SEQ city deal, and about an hour and a half talking about waste reduction, which was okay, and then an hour and stuff on lunch and afternoon tea. We didn't talk about climate change at all. It was bizarre, this cognitive dissonance. But that's sort of the mainstream paradigm we're working with at the moment. I guess one provocation is that we all need to spend a little more attention on pushing local councils, because they are a key player in this space, particularly in terms of bridging community with institutional power. We all know, I'm sure most of us in this room have a rough idea of like what sustainable cities look like. And so I'm not going to talk about like planting more trees and local urban farms and more public transport and bike lanes and solar panels on the roofs. We get all that stuff. I think one question I've been starting to grapple with a little bit that I don't yet have clear answers to is how we navigate the need to relocate people who are particularly flood prone. Already, I was talking to the Noosa councillors today, and they're getting lobbied by people who live right on the waterfront who are saying to the council, hey, you need to build us a seawall and you need to allow us to continue to expand our properties out onto the, flood, like tide vulnerable sites. And what we're staring at a future of is that there'll be these different sectors of the city, very rich people in riverfront homes lobbying for changes to protect their properties. We'll have really low-income people in low-lying areas, places like Rockley that got flooded in 2011, etc. Will we compensate these people when we force them out of their homes? Will we wait till the last minute and then pay them crumbs and say, sorry, your property's not worth much now because it's underwater? What is our sort of housing response going to be in that context? I think, though, the issue we get distracted from, and even it's sort of been sidelined a bit in all the climate conferences and stuff, is that climate change has almost crowded out the space for a deeper conversation about challenging growth and consumerism, and really we need to come back to that underlying core idea of sufficiency. And unfortunately, even in, say, green movements and environmental movements, there's still this narrative of we just build faster trains and solar panels and we don't have to give up anything and we don't have to consume less. And actually, for privileged people in places like Brisbane, climate action is going to have to mean less in some ways. It's and less material consumption, maybe taking up less space, and particularly thinking in the context of what is our ethical responsibility to oppressed peoples around the world who are being flooded out or dispossessed. Brisbane is going to have to take in a crap load of climate refugees, and that means all of us are going to have, like the idea of spare bedrooms, forget about it. We're filling those with refugees, and like it or not, that's the reality that we have to start thinking about. And what does it mean ethically to grapple with those tensions, and who gives up what in order to do justice to the more oppressed peoples?
Wow, okay, so there's some big issues there. Yeah.
We only got 45 minutes.
Well, you touched a couple of times on the issue of housing, like the owners of housing and also the people living in vulnerable circumstances. Have you got some thoughts about the impact on people who are living in precarious housing circumstances? So people either who are struggling to pay off a house or are renting. What do you think might be, Penny, the biggest challenges there even in the short term?
Yeah, I think that, like as you say, there's a lot of issues around housing here. Plenty of people in Australia right now are already extremely precarious, living, barely making ends meet, or not making ends meet. About half of Australians now rent, and yeah, I think the reality has been, certainly in southeast Queensland, people getting sort of squished more and more into share houses to be able to afford, to live in places where they can get jobs. I think part of this is going to have to involve, planning how we have our, where we have people living, where we have people working, so that we don't have to have everyone live, we don't have to have so many students all squished in like sardines in, West End and Greenslopes, right? I think to address some of what you're saying there, I think it's very true that we need to get past the idea of growth as an unquestionable aspect here, but I think it's worth emphasizing that doesn't mean everything stops or that everything gets worse, because it's about reframing what production is for, right? Currently, production is all about expansion of capital, right? Production is about profit. It's totally dissociated from any concept of usefulness or, making people's lives better. I mean, some of the most extreme examples we've been seeing lately, things in the crypto markets, for example, cooking the planet for pictures of a chimp smoking a joint or whatever, which is somehow worth more than you know, the house that I live in. But you know, but I think that we can frame this in terms of what people gain as well. Like, you know, yes, people can't have, like, the planet can't survive and people still buy Funko Pops. Like, we need to melt down every single one of those things and no one could never buy one of those again, right? Like, the planet can't survive that stuff, right? But what the planet can survive and what we honestly need is more leisure time, is to have more time to live your life and not always be traveling from place to, you know, from place to place, having to work, having to do all this sort of stuff. And we can have, I think there's a lot of things that we can have more of through sort of application of scale, right? I mean, one thing that I've often encountered in sort of discussions about, like, you know, renting and housing rights in the context of climate change and sustainability is air conditioning, right? Does everyone get to have air conditioning? And quite frankly, I think if you wanted to ensure that we all, you know, drown in a tide of blood-tinged salt water, telling people in southeast Queensland that they can't have air conditioning would be a great start. You know, like, obviously air conditioning is very energy intensive, but there are ways to use things like air conditioning and, you know, refrigeration more efficiently. For example, doing efficiency at scale, doing refrigeration at scale, you know, large-scale shared units, large-scale shared refrigeration and cooling units shared by multiple residences and so on, that uses far less power. There was a bit of a ramble all over the place with a few different things here, but yeah, to get back more to the question, I think it's, yeah, there's a lot of people who are extremely precarious. Things are only getting worse here in southeast Queensland, and quite frankly, I think a lot of people like myself who rent are looking at things, well, both the combination of climate change and the upcoming Olympic Games, and thinking, oh, awesome, we're all going to be forced out of the city, right? We you know, either it'll be too hot to live here or the rent will be too high, you know.
So I mean, the point that you raised a bit earlier about the nature of production, like this, and perhaps this notion of reframing what's socially useful production rather than just simply following whatever vagaries the market sort of jumps on. I mean, this sort of picks up on something perhaps that you were talking about earlier today, Kurt, about facing these difficult questions about you know, what's seen as essential work and what you know, this is an opportunity too. Like, it's a possibility to change the way in which the economy is structured, change the priorities we give to particular forms of work. But there are certainly obstacles in the way of doing that. You know, it's not like that's going to be an easy thing, because it requires, you know, decisions to be made about properly compensating people for the work they do and not treating everybody as if they're, you know, casualised and precarious workers who can be, you know, used up and thrown away. Would you like to sort of expand on any of those themes?
Yeah, let me do my best. Like, it's really interesting listening to, yeah, just even that exchange between Jonathan and Penny just now. That, yeah, it feels as though both of those things are right. Like, we've got to be focused on stopping certain things that are going on. And at the same time, we've got to be focused on the things that we want to make anew. The cities and the systems that we want to make that are going to address all the injustices and inequalities that, you know, we're targeting in a urban climate justice kind of movement. And yeah, it does strike me that at least one of the difficult conversations there is just that, you know, the old chestnut of jobs versus the environment. And I guess that's a question that I'm increasingly agitated about, right? Is what kinds of work are we going to make if we do manage to win significant investment in a whole bunch of climate justice initiatives that we know are necessary? So, like, some of the examples I was talking about this morning, but that I think do pick up on some things that people have mentioned here, is that, is like I think a few of you have said, like a climate justice project would surely involve expanding public transport and having more equitable public collective mobility. But like here in Sydney, where I am, the government has been busy increasing the frequency of buses, which is great. They're building new metro lines, which is great. And like on the one hand, it's great, but on the other hand, those investments in public transport are accompanied by privatisation and automation. So that, like, if we think about the bus network, just about all the bus drivers these days are casual, and those that are lucky enough to have continuing jobs are working split shifts in depots that are miles from their home. So they do a few hours in the morning, sit around the depot unpaid for a few hours in the middle of the day before they then do another peak hour at the end. And the shiny new privately operated metro doesn't even have drivers or guards. They've just cut the jobs and it's all automated. If we think about housing and housing precarity and housing quality, like retrofitting housing, especially in our hottest suburbs, is going to be part of a climate justice program and would be decent stimulus too if we did it right. But again, last time we rolled out a national construction-based stimulus after the global financial crisis, we did it in a way that we contracted it all out to a whole bunch of operators, not all of whom were above board. There was all sorts of profiteering and shortcuts, including shortcuts on work health and safety that cost some young workers their lives. We could think about all the care for each other and care for country that we're going to need to do in a climate justice program that's low emissions work, and it centres First Nations sovereignty and knowledge. But again, the expertise and the work that elders and knowledge keepers perform, or that the overwhelmingly migrant and female workforce perform in a corporatised human services sector, is just always undervalued, like politically and economically. So like I could go on with more and more examples, but I guess just for me, that all signals that a struggle for climate justice in cities has got to include a struggle for decent work and a campaign against exploitation and dispossession as like part of that struggle. And, you know, the environment and the labour movements haven't always got on. I think it's easy to say that they've got shared interests in, you know, decent work and a decent environment, but actually making that more than just a sort of glib catchphrase and making it real is just, it's a long process of, you know, deep relational engagement across those organisations where we actually tease out what the different priorities and needs are and figure out ways to work together on them. And like I can see cool things happening in that space in various places with all the discussions around the Green New Deal centering issues like that in the US and here and elsewhere. So it's, you know, it's exciting time to be thinking about this stuff, and I think we can do it. And it's kind of like, yeah, you know, as one of my heroes, Jack Mundy, said 50 years ago that, you know, it's still true now that unless we do build real deep relationships between the struggles over climate and work, we're going to have a hard time winning either of them. So, yeah.
Thanks, Kurt. That's great. Look, some of the things that we've talked about so far tap into those notions of, you know, what we mean by justice and, you know, what are the politics of climate change in an urban setting. Another theme that came out of the discussion this morning was this idea of valuing local engagement. So people at a local scale doing things that aren't necessarily generated by, you know, top-down policies. So people getting out and actually involving themselves in their own communities and engaging in forms of, you know, guerrilla activism. So maybe it would be appropriate for our gardeners to let us know what they've been doing, and I guess how you feel the work you do can contribute in a, you know, real way for, you know, not just addressing practical questions, but maybe does it have a broader political input?
Yeah. Well, I think firstly, it's almost impossible to talk about climate justice without talking about the root cause of climate injustice, or the root cause of injustice. And to me, it's the fact that we live in a world that's driven almost entirely by profit. and it's because of our governing systems like capitalism that create these kind of really uneven playing grounds where people can profit from other people's labour or people can own other people's homes. And I think, you know, when we started growing forward, a lot of the conversations we were having were around kind of developing something that's local, that's not about the individual, but it's about the community, and something that addresses or challenges kind of this pillar of capitalism, which is the shift from communal custodianship of land to the private ownership of land. And so we wanted to kind of find a plot of land that was, you know, misused by the government, or kind of, you know, had become a space that wasn't really engaged in by the local community, and then kind of turn that into a space that produces food for free and gives it away for free to people who need it, as a way of kind of like engaging the local community, but also really asking bigger questions about capitalism and the system that we live in. And I think we started it during the very beginning of COVID, or like when COVID hit kind of Brisbane. And it was an interesting time to do that because there was kind of this general heightened fear in the community about what will happen with the collapse of the welfare state, or what will happen if people, you know, can't get food because everybody's in lockdown. And that was a real fear that we had as well. And there were all of these layers of bureaucracy that we saw kind of that were preventing us from just going and starting a garden and talking to people and sharing skills and having those conversations about actually sometimes when there are really bad laws that are harming people and environments, we have a responsibility to break them. And we have a responsibility to ourselves and to each other to try and resist against a system, an organising system, an organising structure that is killing us and everything that exists. Yeah.
Just maybe just to add on to that, I guess within like growing forward, we it's more about like food sovereignty as well. So like a lot like it, just echoing what you guys have been saying as well. So it's about like the people who are putting effort into the garden have autonomy and have decisions into like how that food should be distributed and how that food should be grown as well. So obviously if people feel empowered in those spaces to make decisions at a community level, we're going to obviously choose to grow food sustainably and give food away to people in our community that like need it. So I think it's empowering in that way, because obviously at the moment we're living in a society where we have people, you know, these politicians who are just like, you know, rich white old men mainly, who are making decisions about the climate crisis, and because it's like we live in capitalism, they're always going to choose profit over, you know, the welfare of the environment and people. And so we need to try and find ways so that the people who are going to be impacted by the climate crisis, we need to try and take control of the decision making. So that's like one of the really things I like about like going into these spaces. It was like state government and they were making decisions about how that land should be used, and instead now, you know, the community is making decisions about how that space can be used. And like, obviously, you know, we're doing a better job than the government would be, because they can't just like abandon it and, you know, we're probably going to use it for profit or whatever. So yeah.
So what kinds of obstacles did you face in the like are there real sort of like is there red tape that you've had to go through, or you just managed to avoid that, or you know?
Well, basically, we just went in and we didn't ask for permission from the state because, you know, this is stolen land. It's Indigenous land. So we asked permission from traditional owners. Like we weren't like we have connections to like Auntie Karen, Auntie Deb, who are Yagara women, and we asked them for permission. Then we just like did the garden. And then, yeah, a couple of days later, the state government put up, you know, these 2 massive signs being like, trespassers will be prosecuted, and put up like these bollards and stuff. And then ever since then, we just ignored them. They sent emails being like, you have to get insurance, it's going to cost this much, and it has to be for like $20 million, and you have to like do all these like bureaucracy things. So we just like ignored it. And also like as a really good ally, Jonathan Shrie also helped with that liaison with the with the state as well. And we basically, yeah, just ignored them. We
also, just to add to that, we also had, during COVID, there the question of essential work. What is essential work? We essentially began during a lockdown where you couldn't leave the house unless you were doing essential work. And so we got in contact with Jono, and Jono kind of just wrote us a letter saying, these guys are doing essential work. And so we had about 10 people. We had like a healthcare worker who kind of developed a COVID safety plan and like a station. So there were only a few people at the same time kind of working on the garden. But we also had this little piece of paper that made us feel strong. We said, you can talk to Jonathan Shrie. So yeah, there was that buffer as well.
So I mean, that's an interesting example of, Jonathan, you obviously have this role where you are still basically an activist, but also a local politician. So how do you find balancing those, because they're both different sorts of political activism in a way, aren't they?
Yeah,
so
but maybe they don't have to be, and I think that's because I think it's possible to be an activist and a local councillor, but we need to redefine what it means to be a local representative and to be a facilitator of community rather than a representative of community. And so, yeah, I mean, it's stressful at times, and I think eventually the number of councillor conduct review complaints will mount up and I'll be dismissed or forced out or whatever. But it's sort of like I can get a lot done until they kick me out kind of thing. Yeah. yeah. So far, so good.
I'm just going to throw this back over to Sydney to ask Kurt a follow-up question here about this idea of essential too. How do we, obviously that word's been bandied around a lot during the pandemic, but it's also something that's very relevant to this other crisis we're in, and how do we go about defining what forms of work are, socially valuable, socially necessary, and will contribute to, a more just society? How do those, how do we resolve that kind of dilemma? Because it obviously brings in lots of conflictual definitions about, the good society, or, what different interest groups want.
Yeah, and I'm probably not saying anything that deep here, but it has been an incredible moment, hasn't it, for there suddenly being, just for a few weeks here in our most recent lockdown, like even conservative politicians having to front microphones with a lot of cameras pointed at them, talking about like our logistics workers getting us through this pandemic, and sort of recognizing a whole bunch of workers and work that has been, generally speaking, made invisible in the city, and then made precarious in the process of being made invisible. And so, yeah, I think the kind of political opening at the moment is, now that the work has been made visible, how do we therefore also make it less precarious and less dangerous? Because I think this is the other really interesting thing, just even listening to that story, right? Which is that there's simultaneously an awesome process there of you guys defining your work as essential, and that's a political, act that you've undergone, and then working with Jonathan to get that recognised in some form so that you can actually tactically work around the restrictions. But just also knowing that a lot of people who were told that they were essential workers, they didn't get a choice about whether they had to keep going to work. They got defined as essential and effectively then told by their employers, if you don't keep putting yourself at risk and coming to unsafe workplaces, we'll find someone else to do it, and you're out. So it's, you can see how that concept has just been really fluid and dynamic politically. But the fact that there is this fluidity and uncertainty around it at the moment, I think is a real opportunity. And certainly I've just, been watching and working with comrades here in left and right-wing unions, United Workers Union in the care and logistics sector, Rail, Tram and Bus Union in the public transport sector, who are getting more assertive about the essential work that they perform. And one of the experiences of the green bands that I'm obsessed with from 50 years ago that was so important to that mobilisation was the pride that happened around what building workers did. And you can go back and read all the interviews with people at the time who said, this is I've been a building worker for 15 years and it used to be 10 years ago when people asked me what I did, I was embarrassed to talk about it. And now I'm proud. And that pride was actually a kind of first step towards a much more radical political program. And so it's kind of a really pretty hopeful moment in some ways, that you can see how, yeah, as I say, some of that precarious work, there's a lot of pride in it at the moment as well, because there is public recognition. So let's see what political program we can keep building to improve the conditions of it now that it's been recognised for what it is.
So another thing that seems, interesting to me, coming from the last couple of comments we've had from people, is just the balancing of DIY activities, or people taking control, self-managing their communities and not asking for permission, but just doing things, redefining through practice that certain things are essential or important or valuable. But there's also the other sort of side of our interest in politics is the top-down stuff, and the fact that lots of resources are available through the state. And I guess the other side of being able to do things is financial. And I'm just wondering to what extent, and we don't have to do one or the other, but to what extent is it possible to reconfigure the state to do things that are more progressive and intervene in ways which are able to address things like, climate justice in an urban setting. So I'm thinking particularly about, say, housing or transport, but what role is there for social housing and for interventions of, from the top down, like building dwellings for people so that people can live in some level of comfort without feeling like they're constantly, close to the bone and, precarious, living on the edge. What do you think, Penny?
Yeah, I think I'm personally rather skeptical of that. I think that it's very tempting to believe that this is something that can happen from the top down, because it's very easy to imagine yourself in the place of the state and to think of, oh well, if I had all the all these levers of government and so on, what would I do and so on. I think it's important to recognise that while it's not that people in activists taking political running for elections and taking political office and so on, like Jonathan and so on, I don't in any way want to minimise the great work John has done, like incredible work, and continues to do incredible work. But I think that it's the idea that we can simply we could simply take state power and use that in a through sort of elections and all this sort of stuff to implement something that is contrary to the interests of capital is simply not realistic. Like, capital itself has such strong imperatives and is so politically dominant that, well, I mean, think of it this way. Think about how in the UK, when there was some threat of, well, not even a revolutionary, an actual social democrat taking power, members of the military, high-up members of the military were quite openly talking about performing a coup, like in Parliament. It was, I think that we have to rely on ourselves from the bottom up to, to force these things. Like, Secure's founding philosophy is, we know that there are institutions that work within there are groups that advocate for renters within the institutions of, the RTA and so on, and that's great. And we work with them when that's when it can be done within those institutions. But we will never get any sort of housing justice or, decent living accommodations for the majority of people working through those mechanisms. We have to build power from the bottom up, not to make demands, or not to, I should say, bring them to negotiating table, really just build power from the bottom up and take things with the power of people on the ground. And if the state makes concessions to us to try to mollify us, great. We'll only go in even harder. Like, great, that's awesome. We've got more that we can work with. We'll take more. But anything that's appealing to the state and is trying to, get the state on our side, play buddy-buddy, I don't think is a winning strategy. And I think, just one last thing here, I think that this is going to be something that's going to be very important to remember in coming years, because I don't know if you've seen that the ACTU and ACTU, World Wildlife Fund, another conservation group, and sort of the, forgetting the name of it, but the sort of the peak body for Australian business recently basically put forward a proposal for a green accord, which was, something like a sort of an Australian Green New Deal, which was received fairly well in the Murdoch press, which seems to suggest to me that Mr. Murdoch has decided to crown a new king, and we will, in coming years, I think, likely see a federal Labor government which will be doing a fairly significant sort of sort of green jobs, reforms, etc., maybe throwing some concessions in terms of better working conditions for workers and so on. But I think a lot of people are going to be very tempted to believe that we've won, we've solved it, we've squared the circle. We have sustainable social democracy, and this is going to be great and all the rest. And I just want to remind you that capital only concedes to this because they think that they can get more out of it. Capital only concedes to this because they believe that they can increase their profit margins by it, or because they think their profits would be even more threatened without it by, say, people being dissatisfied. And what we might do with that dissatisfaction. So I wanna really emphasize to people that those sorts of top-down solutions, they're tempting. You're going to hear a lot of them. You're going to hear you're going to hear some people be incredibly smug about "I told you so" on this sort of stuff, and they're going to be wrong. Don't believe it.
I think Penny's right, and I think that we have to remember that there's no way to accrue hierarchical establishment power without being co-opted and disciplined by it. But the deeper point, which we've sort of skated around, which I was sort of trying to unpick earlier, is that even the strongest form of what might be called like anti-capitalist green utopianism, where we have, sees a bit of, like, there are openings in the state, obviously, sees a bit of power, build more public housing, bullet trains, all that sort of stuff, green jobs in solar panels and renewable, all of that sort of stuff. Put aside the greenwashed capitalist version of that, which is obviously nonsense and still problematic. But even this kind of democratic socialist Green New Deal that posits, like even some of the stuff you were talking about before, like that's the message you use when you're trying to win over reformists and people who are a bit still embedded in the status quo. But what I'm suggesting is even a challenge to some of that green anti-capitalist utopianism that which maybe is the difference between building new public housing versus repurposing existing empty office blocks as public housing. And maybe it's the difference between you don't actually get a high-speed, high-frequency bullet train, but can we create a world where no one's time poor and you don't mind sitting and waiting for the train and talking to the people next to you because that's okay too. And I think there's a subtle distinction in there that we're still losing. And that's why I hasten to emphasize that even under the most utopian anti-capitalist green framing of this stuff that rejects hierarchical state power, et cetera, we are still going to have to give something up, and we have to be willing to acknowledge that, because otherwise, if we tell people the dominant message, which is we all have something to gain from a just transition and we all have something positive to gain from climate action, that crowds out the space for a deeper conversation about decolonization, global international solidarity and justice that, will otherwise be missed from that framing. But anyway, I don't want to go on too much about that. But
it's a good point. Okay, there's a couple of things I was thinking of adding to this, but I think we've got at least one question from the ether. So some viewer, hello viewer,
That's it. I'll just be a little voice to represent. And we've got a question here from Dr. Indigo Willing, who's asking Jonathan Shrie and perhaps the other panellists to talk a little bit about helping people from urban subcultures, for instance, skateboarding, to navigate a right to use the city. For instance, needing concrete whilst also being sensitive to the environment, and how do you kind of walk that line, perhaps?
Lot of stuff here, right? Like the public spaces are being increasingly privatised and commodified and regulated and controlled. But adaptable public spaces that are open to different groups to use organically are really important for community building and cultural renewal, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this is a tension between state-centric, we could have a really democratic government, but it's still going to be bureaucratic as opposed to anarchic, decentralised community decision-making about how spaces are used. And I think, I don't want to go on and on about it, but I think we all have an obligation to fight for those spaces and subcultures as intrinsically valuable in and of themselves, but also as part of an ecosystem of resistance and countercultural change, and recognising that, fighting for a local skate park so that people can gather and engage in a valuable recreation activity is also a form of climate change, not just because it stops people having to drive to the other side of the city and get in their car and et cetera, but because there's something about localised, organic, bottom-up culture that is worth preserving in and of itself. But yeah, I don't want to take up too much time on the mic.
Well, I was just going to maybe ask you about that, Kurt. I know you've done quite a bit of work on citizenship and people doing DIY activities in cities. The political consequences of that how do you see that kind of, I guess, the right to appropriate space being? Is it primarily about a political act, or is it something just about making life more livable, more humane?
Yeah, again, I feel like for me, it's like actually a case-by-case question, right? And the question is about what are those appropriations being done in the name of? And I guess, we've sort of seen, I think also during the pandemic and the kind of discussions about publics in a sort of pandemic situation, there's lots of tactical appropriations of public space for a whole bunch of things that aren't anything to do with justice or citizenship. It's to do with how do we find ways to enable consumption to keep happening when it can't happen indoors. So let's appropriate some public space to make that happen. And then there are, insurgent appropriations of public space that are about, making suburban streets safe for kids to ride their bikes and skateboards and scooters on without getting killed by cars zooming past at 70 kilometres an hour. So do you know what I mean? It's not about the tactic for me. It's about what it's being done to enable and facilitate, and who's doing it, and what kind of relations are being constructed in the process of that making. It's really a case-by-case proposition, because I think the tactic of that sort of, DIY appropriation can be picked up for a whole bunch of different political purposes by a whole bunch of actors.
If I can just add, when I first got elected in 2016, we were really strongly inspired by the idea of the right to the city philosophies, that we are all co-creating urban spaces, the city shapes us and we shape the city. We have a right to define how neighbourhoods change and evolve, et cetera, which is a really powerful framing and set of ideas that to some extent came out of the global north. But it's complicated by our status as settlers or invaders here. And we ended up to some extent departing from that right to the city framing, because it was also who the hell are we to say this is our public space, we as citizens will define how it's used, when actually it's Aboriginal land. And I think that tension, some of those, the philosophies coming out of Barcelona around right to the city don't necessarily map directly onto colonised countries.
So maybe, Greg, have you got some thoughts about that notion of the right to the city and citizens taking control, and what does that really mean?
Historically, Aboriginal people really hadn't had that much access to this space, and in many ways it still plays out. It's just they just changed the goalposts. So, for example, this bridge that's being built, the Neville Bonner Bridge, the state government has chosen to lock out the actual the real family members as part of the consultation. So they're just doing what they want to do in order to get the infrastructure built. So what does that say to the family in terms of justice? And what they've done is literally how they possess our land. So they've possessed Neville Bonner because he entered Parliament, that he now belongs to the state. So they've totally pushed the family aside. So these things play out in all different types of ways. But when we come into the city, we don't see ourselves reflected in it. Not much at all. We're starting to see little bits and pieces. We still have some names in particular areas, but it's very Western-centric. We celebrate all of the colonial history. If you go to Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, the precincts are all the same. The buildings may just look a little bit different. So we're starting to have a little bit of change, but particularly here in Queensland, which has a horrid colonial history, we are still dealing with this, whether non-Indigenous people want to acknowledge that or not. And that sort of comes back to that conversation we were having earlier today about this acknowledgement of country business, and it's turned into a, like a spoken sentence or just a few things. But what it really is for us, it's if you're prepared to do that, you should be doing it in your everyday, in your work, because that's how you actually acknowledge that we are still here and how we still actually might be here later. We're still recovering. So all these things are going on around us. We don't have enough bodies to be in every single space. And it's great that we all have relationships with elders in our communities and stuff like that. But our elders, their time is being taken up by all of these needs of the state. And we're not getting all of this rich cultural information transmitted back to us before it's too late. So we're dealing with all of these other factors on top of all of these other factors internally in our community. So I just think really to include Aboriginal people in this movement or this community of practice, that everybody's, obviously on board. I'll just go back to that point about centering country in all of it, because that's really going to actually help us to make sure that we're included when we've always been excluded.
If you walk around Boundary Street, you'll see postcodes written up like 4605, which is Cherbourg postcode, and 4077, which is Anala. It's like young Murray kids in the inner city scrawling tags, which people see as vandalism, but that's a form of placemaking, and young kids saying, hey, I exist too, I'm asserting a claim to this space, this is my name, this is where I'm from. But it's just been like, oh yeah, that's just tagging, we've got to paint over that. And I find that there's some poetry in that, or something really interesting in that act of asserting, oh, we're here too, and anyway.
Just when they were developing it, so just near Admiralty Towers, and I was with an Aboriginal lady that I know, and we just looked down into some old concrete, but someone had written in it, "There now," which was quite funny to us. So we were like, oh wow, we took a photo, because that's, for us, oh yeah, someone's been here that we know.
Well, I've been very neglectful of our in-person audience here. Are there any comments or questions people have from the crowd? Hey, come on to the mic.
Thanks everyone, a really fascinating discussion. I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on the city beyond our own city, our own city place. Particularly thinking about climate change as a planetary concern that requires collective action far beyond our own horizon. Is there a role, or are we doing enough to cultivate transnational, or dare we say trans-urban relationships, or coalitions, forms of solidarity with cities and city dwellers elsewhere? And when I say trans-urban, I don't mean the toll collecting company. The other question I have was picked up on before, but I'd like to press you all a bit more on this. Cities are becoming increasingly securitized spaces. How do we negotiate those processes and practices to affect the kind of transformation that you're all certainly intimating? Thank you.
Thanks, Samid. Who'd like to have a go at that one?
I've spoken a lot, so I'll let someone else go first.
All right. Well, as far as just addressing the second one there, I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think the only way to, again, this is, that type of securitization is following the imperatives of capital. Capital will, wherever it is able, it will erect barriers and, charge you money to go through them or exclude certain people or whatever is necessary to, squeeze blood out of a stone, right? To squeeze more money out. And the only reason this happens, well, two reasons. One, declining rate of profit, need to find more profit, but also the second one is because they think they can get away with it. The only way around that is proving them false on that, is creating direct resistance that pushes back against that and makes their nominal property rights to bar people from certain spaces, surveil people, create, extract rents from certain places or whatever, makes that a dead letter. As far as solidarity across, between cities, across borders and so on, I think that's absolutely, I think that is non-optional. I think that's absolutely necessary to any practical organizing in the present and going into the future, because a huge part of how people have managed to be persuaded not to have a huge freak out about like us cooking the planet is the sort of idea of, oh well, those guys over there, they're doing this, and if we don't do, if we do this but they don't, nothing's going to happen here, right? Like creating solidarity across borders and organizing across borders, I think, is it's non-optional. Anyone who's not creating those connections across borders, and I should note while secure is obviously very specifically geographically limited to Southeast Queensland, we do have connections with, say, Rahu and Victoria and many other radical tenants unions elsewhere in the world for sharing ideas and strategies and so on. I think that sort of international, interurban, whatever, solidarity and coordination is essential.
Can I just add on to the second question? And I think it's something that I think about a lot with this kind of forum is around how there's some really big barriers that prevent people from kind of feeling that they can take ownership of public space or privately owned space. And I think one of those really big ones is capitalist realism. And by that I mean that we live in this system that has been so normalized that people don't actually realize we're living in a system called capitalism. And because there's not a realization that capitalism is our governing system as such, or that it's driven predominantly by profit, it then becomes very difficult to reimagine an alternative organizing system. And it also becomes very difficult to imagine kind of breaking rules and, taking space or kind of like really, there's this idea of place is just accepted as how it is. And I think because of the nature of the working week and how much people participate in capitalism, it becomes very hard to actually have the material kind of needs or material resources to go out and really assert that kind of protest that's needed, or like starting to kind of organize in a way that challenges that is really difficult, which is kind of part of the biggest problem I think we're facing in terms of thinking about these kinds of questions.
I think to come back as well to the securitization question, which I think is a really, like, how do we navigate in the here and now? I think one of the elements is to be really skeptical of the tools of surveillance and resist the temptation to use them for good purposes. You know, like the piano that we put in a park in Boundary Street gets vandalised roughly once a year, and the cops will come around and be like, Jono, we've got some security camera footage. I'm like, I don't want to see it. And you know, the transport planners will want to use security camera footage to try and decide how many people are walking and being really dubious about some of those measures, I think, is really important, rather than just saying, oh, well, we've got it now, we might as well use it. I think is an important piece of the puzzle. But to come to the really interesting question of transnational solidarity, it's also about recognising that the city has a hinterland footprint. You know, cities are inherently parasitic in terms of the resources they can consume and the workers they exploit. And so, you know, the material that we rely upon here comes from somewhere. It's dug up from somewhere or whatever. It's burnt. And so what is our ethical responsibility to those communities? And also in terms of, you know, Ipswich wants to be the arms dealing hub of the Southern Hemisphere, right? As Queensland moves away from coal, one of the primary industries that the Queensland government and the federal government is trying to shift us into is military weapons manufacturing. And so we have to build solidarity with, you know, the people of like Libya and Eritrea and people of Palestine where these weapons are being sold. And I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle. Like the urban capitalist city depends upon violence done in other places in order to keep that profit machine turning. And so resisting that and building those alliances is also part of the struggle.
So can I draw on your disciplinary expertise here as a geographer, Kurt, to think about this idea of planetary urbanisation, whether you find it useful to extrapolate, you know, that notion of the globe becoming urbanised, and that's got imperatives built into it, that because of the hinterland that the city consumes and, you know, cannot live without, that there's imperatives there politically too. Like the flip side of it is that we must also globalise our networks and connections and build coalitions. That's easy to say, but yeah, I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts about whether we're in a really changed environment now than perhaps we were even 20 years ago.
Like I think we've got we've got tools at our disposal for doing some of this stuff that maybe we didn't have 20 years ago that are making it like I can see how they're being deployed in all sorts of ways. But I think to not get completely you know, blinkered by the shiny new and see that there's a whole bunch of just sort of, again, like approaches to building relationships across space that are going to require more than, you know, sharing each other's tweets and doing all the things that we can also do to make connections. And so, like some work I've been doing with Amanda Tattersall down here about like what we're roughly, you know, talking about as sort of people power strategies in cities. Like, yeah, it's really interesting watching, particularly, I guess, a bunch of sort of both political and regional networks that are facilitating some fantastic and, you know, exchanges that are making really interesting differences to the people in the places that are having those exchanges. So one of them that we've been working with people in both places is the housing movements in Barcelona and Cape Town, right? Which are like radically different cities on one level, but actually through a kind of in-person exchange that happened through the Fearless Cities Network, where a few folks from Cape Town managed to get funded to get across to a networking event in Barcelona and then go and turn up to a bunch of advice assemblies that La Paz were putting on to work with people who were being evicted about how to support each other to block the evictions. They took that assembly idea back to Cape Town, transformed it for their circumstances, translated it, and then, you know, a group of folks from Barcelona then picked up on some of the translations and transformations that had happened in Cape Town. And there's just this looping exchange going on, which has been amazing to watch. But I think also, as Jonathan's saying, the question that got asked also does just, you know, like we all probably know, like the other political thing that is just so imperative right now is breaking down the kind of the city-rural barrier that is just getting mobilised to divide and conquer us. frankly. And again, just on a very small scale, but watching something like a community energy project that I've been, following here, called Haystacks, that's actually, locating a solar garden in a regional area. And it's mostly urban folks who don't have their own houses to put their own solar panels on that are participating in it. But there's a really intentional process, not just of like, oh, okay, let's put a bunch of solar panels in a regional area and, hey presto, sell the power back to the city, but actually a really intentional political process of making sure that those people are meeting one another and hearing about the circumstances of rural communities and what it means to have renewables in their community, and them hearing about and just breaking down all the divisions that are constantly being used to divide us. So I think that city, country, rural thing is another really big networking challenge for us all.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Yeah, Penny. Yeah.
Sorry, we've got a lady over here who's been waiting a very long time. I just very quickly wanted to address what Kurt said, the last bit there. I think that's really important. The idea of breaking down that city, that urban-rural divide is really important because, quite frankly, rebuilding our economy on a sustainable basis will require a lot more people to be living in the country. If for no other reason, obviously there's plenty of stuff in terms of, people being, working on revitalizing ecosystems, trying to, stabilize dying and collapsing ecosystems or reestablish them and so on. But one of the things I think is most important to consider is our current agricultural system. It is extremely labor efficient, but it is terribly land inefficient and is terribly, obviously ecologically disastrous, right? We know perfectly well how to grow far more food for the same amount of space and in ecologically sustainable ways. The only thing that the barrier there is that it is more labor intensive. Now, for capital, that is a complete no-no because, of course, labor or rents are the source of pretty much all costs under capitalism, right? We need to be considering that, while cities obviously will still exist, there's still going to be a lot of people living in cities, and quite frankly, I don't plan on leaving the city. I like it here. I like cities, but there's going to have to be a lot of people moving out to the country. I think you'd find quite a fair few people who would be very keen to do that if they could be guaranteed a good standard of living and, basically not being thrown out into a dying hinterland, which is what a lot of the rural areas are right now.
Okay, thanks for that, Penny. We're crossing over now to Sue.
Just super quick, I just wanted to talk to Greg. As part of our deep listening tour, we also spoke to people in some of the far north Queensland cities, Townsville and Cairns and places like that, and I've been worried for a while about free spaces, air-conditioned spaces for people to be in where they don't have to spend money. They're really thin on the ground and they're really important for places that experience extremely hot weather. So I'm concerned about people wanting to be in air-conditioned spaces that are congenial, but also facing them private security and a whole range of issues. It's coming up more and more. So, how can community gardens are brilliant. Libraries play a really important part, but, they're not open all the time. So, we need more spaces, I guess, where people are safe, they don't have to spend money, and they can get out of the weather. It's going to be a big deal for evacuations as well. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that. And then we have a web question.
Well, I can only comment from stories that I hear and things that I see on social media, where it just always seems the further north you go, the worse it is for blackfellas, especially in public spaces. If you're there just, enjoying a drink, a Coke or something, loitering, I don't know, racism is a lot worse the further north you go in Queensland, always has been. I've experienced it myself. And so, look, because I've never actually lived there, it's hard for me to to say, but I can certainly sympathise with the stories that I have heard. I have seen a few sort of very distasteful things, but yeah, I mean, they can't even sit in the park without being, you know, labelled of there's the drunks, or there's this, there's that, and it's just part of that human behaviour to stereotype people into particular roles inside urban areas. It's something, I think, there's a lot of social issues in North Queensland that need to be addressed. That's just one of them. It makes you wonder why they go out half the time. I mean, to go and have a night out on the town, I mean, depending how black you are, will depend on if you get in the door. That's pretty much it.
In the same vein that, this was the case 18 months ago. I don't know if it's still the case, but if you, this space, the State Library, was designed to be an open, accessible, 24-hour public space, and even the toilet block is kind of separate, so you can leave the loo open without opening up the rest of the building. They still lock the toilet, even though it was designed that it could be open. And if you're a homeless person sitting here, the guards will leave you alone. You're allowed to sit there, but the moment you try and lie down, they'll come and see you on the camera, and they'll come and walk over and tell you to move on. And that's happening in a public building and under the control of the state. Anyway, sorry, you got another question? But
yeah, well, just a question from Salvador, who asks, I'm wondering if, or maybe how, the panel considers community resilience in the strategies you design to carry out your work. And I mean, I think that'd be maybe some learnings that we could all take away from, if you've got any perspectives around community resilience and building that into what you do. Yeah.
I think resilience comes from redundancy and having a wide range of systems rather than putting all our eggs in one basket. And food is a really good example. Like, we need our urban farms, we need our peri-urban agriculture, we need a range, and so that's really important. Resilience also comes from decentralising control, so that decision-making power isn't concentrated, and that not everything is dependent on one person or one entity or agency, so that, you know, in a disaster, that person's missing, the house of cards shouldn't collapse because of that. But I'm sure others have got stuff to add.
I think it's also about doing community resilience is about fighting against systems of oppression. But it's also, the other part I love about activism as well is also how do we create the communities that we actually want to live in, or the world we want to create. So I think it's really important that, you know, just protesting out on the streets for whatever it is, that's just one small part of community resilience. It's also about you know, how we care for each other. You know, how when people are being hurt by systems of racism, or you know, when people can't put food on the table, how are we meant to give mutual aid to each other? And then also, if we can give mutual aid to each other and support the community, then we're also more able and more stronger to, you know, keep on fighting, because it can be a really exhausting thing sometimes. So yeah, it's also about giving mutual aid to each other and building strength from there as well.
Can I just touch on what you asked me just before? I just sort of think about some of the things that have happened in Brisbane over the last 20 years in terms of the loss of space that Indigenous people would normally take up. So one place I could think of is the lounge at the Fortitude Valley Five Ways. I mean, that used to be a great congregating place, even though sometimes odd things would happen there. But also Musgrave Park. But I think when Aboriginal people come to Brisbane from out of town, Musgrave has always been a place to go and find, do you know where so-and-so is, even for my own family. And so that still happens to some degree, but I would understand that in Cairns and Townsville, that would happen quite a lot, because the frequency of people getting on planes from remote communities and coming in, sometimes they even get stranded there. There's really nowhere else to go except to those places, so they can find kin and things like that, and you know, be around. So that, I guess, that links to that that public and private space issue. And you know, we've got the similar issue here, but that's sort of now starting to play out in those areas, which kind of made me think, well, what have we learnt about, you know, taking up. So it's nice that they've done up the Esplanade in Cairns and stuff like that, and it's supposed to be a place where you can go and meet. But if there's a large congregation of blackfellas there, well, it's like, you know, police are going backwards and forwards, just waiting just for that one thing, when all they could be doing is just catching up because they haven't seen so-and-so, you know, for 3 months. It can be dangerous for some people. They may not be doing anything at all and get mistaken for doing something wrong, which has happened to members of my own family in the Fortitude Valley Mall. So an uncle of mine that had brain damage, because he limped as he was coming along, he caught his foot on one of the pavers and accidentally brushed up against a policeman. Now that ended up in court because they looked at that as if to say that was assault. So the magistrate took one look at my uncle and went, "You've got to be kidding me," and threw it out. But that's literally the extent of what goes on.
Just if I could, I wanted to, I think just to add to what both three of you have been saying here, I think probably the one thing I can add to that is that, in my experience, in any sort of organising, if you are indispensable, that is not a point of pride, that is a point of shame. If you are indispensable, then you have neglected your duties to train other people to do your job. Because if you are indispensable, what happens when you're not there? When you're sick, when you're too busy working, when you're out of town, whatever. Indispensability is, and it's very tempting to have that, you know, to want to take that on because it makes you feel special and all the rest. No, never. If anytime you see that happen, like, that should be a moment of intervention of, no, teach other people how to do your job.
Well, I think perhaps we are coming close to time. I'm not sure what time we're supposed to end up. So, by virtue of the kind of the dictatorship of the technology, I'm going to give you a chance to say your final thing there, Kurt, if you've got anything else to add, or because I know you've been locked away. This is an opportunity to talk to a big group of people for the last time for the week.
Yeah.
Or we can just say goodbye.
No, and I keep hearing about the snacks that you'll have been eating all weekend. I'm not going to take any of that shit, right? Look, the only thing then, real quick to finish, because I think that last question too was a really good one that ties heaps of things together from tonight for me. But I think just that relationship between the kind of grassroots insurgent stuff that we're doing, but actually the resilience question for me also does, partly come back to questions about how we try and institutionalise our work and get institutional power to keep it going when it gets tricky. And like, I know we all know the risks of that, but I think maybe also acknowledging the necessities of it on some level as well. And so just hearing the different stories about how, like, just some of the kind of, I guess, really crudely, the work of like kind of, it's actually kind of like social reproduction for politics, right? The work of people who are actually holding down a spot in a council that means that you can support cool grassroots initiatives in your city, the people who are holding down a union, the people who are holding down, like, every single invitation that an elder gets to turn up to something and offer perspectives and insights about how to care for country better, like, and the organisations that are supporting those elders to do it, like, how we kind of keep that going without at the same time then letting those institutions and their bureaucracies and their structures, like, constrain us and stop us doing the things we want to do. Like, it's a very cool question to finish with. And for me, like, one of those ongoing struggles of just knowing for all of us when to put your energies into those institutions just to keep them up and running, and when to be like, nah, we've got to do this for ourselves and walk away from them from a minute. So, yeah, anyway, thanks, everybody. I really enjoyed even...
No, thank you, Kurt. I really appreciate the time you've put into today. It's been great to hear you speak and to get your insights on a range of different things we've talked about today. So Can we all thank Kurt and all of our guests on the panel here tonight? Thank you very much for joining. All right, so I don't think I have to say anything else. I think it's snack time.
That's it. It's snack time. So what
Thanks,
that
Greg.
entails, would everybody like to follow a few of us? We go through the info zone and out to the river deck, and please eat a lot because we're a no waste kind of crowd. Okay. Thanks very much for everyone who's joined all these events, and we'll be following up with what comes next.